Eric.
Connor.
Omar?
Con-Air.
Eric? Who do I pick first?
We're asking you to choose right now.
I know. I feel like, who do I love more, mommy or daddy?
Yeah.
You're both my daddy.
No. Well, and that's the topic of today's show, visiting the 8-time Mr. O Zaddy. This is breaking news for Iron Culture, okay? We're going to just share this live. The road to Ronnie is official. It seems like we've managed to get a hold of one Ronald Coleman, 8-time Mr. Olympia, the legend himself. Yeah, buddy. I was hoping.
Ain't nothing but a tree nut.
Yep. As he famously said.
As you know, he actually has a strong peanut allergy, and his southern accent, you think he's saying peanut, but actually saying tree nut.
Yep.
And we will ask him about legumes.
This is fantastic because we're going to have the opportunity to interview a legend. And so we're going to record this episode in order to help inform the audience, for those that are interested, for those that are curious about some of the history of bodybuilding, what led up to Ronnie Coleman, why he is considered the king, why he is probably, and we could agree upon this, the most notable bodybuilder, at least of the last 30 years. And you said, Eric, you feel...
So personally, and I don't think Connor feels the same way, which is I'm excited to hear this, that I think if we kind of take each individual era, that's one conversation. But if we talk about an all-time, which is not a fair conversation, because if you plop someone who's a champion from 30 years ago, they're going to have access to other things.
Yep.
But I think, just kind of bar none, comparing anybody, including the modern era, that Ronnie Coleman is the best bodybuilder that we've ever seen in the IFBB ranks.
That's going to be an exciting conversation. We are joined by the one and only Dr. Conor Heffernan, who stands atop his obelisk next to our pyramid. It's a very interesting, happy arrangement that we have, that we all are atop whatever precipice we need to be in order to gaze down upon everyone else. But this is the Road to Ronnie episode, and then we will have a follow episode, the Ronnie Coleman recap or meeting. We don't know what it would be titled. But Connor, please introduce yourself again for the audience, and let's talk about this man, the road to Ronnie. Why he's almost now this mythical figure, both in the annals of YouTube, social media now, but just the general discourse when it comes to bodybuilding and lifting. He is a larger than life figure. And how did this come to be?
Yeah, so I'm Conor Heffernan, physical culture historian. I have 2 small dogs. I enjoy long walks on the beach. Thoughts? Questions? Oh no, we're here to talk about Ronnie. Okay, so Ronnie Coleman, as I said, 8-time Mr. Olympia. Mr. Olympia is obviously the Super Bowl of bodybuilding, started by Joe and Ben Weider in 1965. And in that time, the cultural touchstones of bodybuilding are the ones who have typically won the Mr. Olympia. So if we think Arnold Schwarzenegger, if we think Frank Zane, if we think Franco Columbu, if we think Lee Haney, Phil Heath, etc., it is the metric by which we measure bodybuilding greatness. It's not the first bodybuilding show that was ever created. It's not arguably the first bodybuilding show that was important that was ever created. Mr. America in 1939 used to have that prestige, as did Mr. Universe. But the Olympia is what we class greatness as. Ronnie is joint second with Lee Haney. As I told you, I don't know what to do with mics. Ronnie is joint second with Lee Haney in terms of the most Olympia wins ever, and was going for his 9th when he was dethroned by Jay Cutler. So this is where we stand. He has more Olympias than Arnold Schwarzenegger. He was probably the most dominant, I think. At certain points in his reign, there was no one who could catch up with him. So it's a very exciting person to talk to. And also, I think, outside of Arnold Schwarzenegger, he probably broke into the mainstream zeitgeist with those YouTube videos, with the "Yeah, buddy, ain't nothing but a peanut," more so than we've seen with other bodybuilders. So it's a very interesting person.
Yeah, just to kind of share my own personal perspective, I think the timing of when I got into bodybuilding is really important here, because I started lifting weights in 2004 and very quickly was kind of on like a pretty serious bodybuilding track. I became aware of natural bodybuilding sometime in 2005, 2006. I think I went to my first natural bodybuilding show in 2006 and decided I want to do that. And at that point, I kind of stopped paying attention to the IFBB, not because I had a moral judgment against untested bodybuilding or enhanced bodybuilding, as we like to call it. Certainly not at all. It was just less relatable to me. And when you're competing in a sport, you're going to be a little more of a fan of the type of thing that you're doing. Personally, I see it as like Formula One and NASCAR. They're just different fuels. We have a lot more in common with the enhanced brethren and sistren than we do with the like, people who aren't bodybuilders at all. I know some natural bodybuilders just really have an issue with the enhanced ranks. That's their choice. But because of the time I came in, Ronnie was the current reigning Mr. Olympia. And because of my general curiosity for history, I went, oh, what's this guy about? And I went back. So the first thing I did was I watched Pumping Iron. And obviously I fell in love with all the greats. And this is going to sound strange juxtaposing with Ronnie, but I really love Frank Zane's physique. That's why in 2019 I did that kind of homage photo shoot. And obviously he was like one of the smallest guys of that era, but I just thought he was put together in a way that really is unique and just was very appealing to me. But when I saw Ronnie, he was just kind of like almost the polar opposite, to the point where I appreciated it. And more so when I went back and studied it. So when you come into bodybuilding in 04, 05, and you learn about Ronnie, he's already won the Olympia 6 or 7 times, right? And that means that you're looking at it as though, like, oh my God, this guy's untouchable, he's unbeatable, like he's the reigning champion. And you kind of, like a lot of other people in that era, they wanted Jay Cutler to win because he had become this like, oh, Ronnie again kind of thing. And they felt like his physique was starting to come down the slope a little bit, and arguably it had. But for me, because I look back at the history, you find out that Ronnie, and I don't want to scoop you in anything, but when Ronnie, although he had some of probably the most amazing genetics in bodybuilding, he was not an IFBB pro champion when he first turned pro. Like, he was placing very low and didn't always qualify for the Olympia. And he went from 9th to 1st, and I'll let you say all the other historian facts after that, because I know you're going to have them better than I do. And his reaction to winning, and the fact that he didn't expect it, and the humility he carried, even as a champion, although he was very confident, it really spoke to me. And it was an underdog story that, for me, once I learned that history, I didn't see him the same way as I think everyone else had, who was more aware of him in a more contemporary fashion. So I don't know, I've always been a huge fan of Ronnie. So it's when you sent the message, you were like, Eric, we got Ronnie. I was like, oh my God. It was very surreal. Even though since 2006 or so, I've really only kind of paid attention to WNBF world champions, natural Olympia champions. Back in the day when the IFPA Yorton Cup was as big as it was, those champions, Ronnie has always had a special place in my heart, and I just can't be more excited.
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned Scoop, but I think something that makes Ronnie such an interesting figure is not that he wasn't meant to be Mr. Olympia, but certainly when he won the Olympia, he was not meant to be Mr. Olympia, because obviously before Ronnie is another great, Dorian Yates. And the story of bodybuilding in the 90s is who can overtake Dorian, and we see a pack which is legendary. Like, and this is not to say that the current crop of, Olympia bodybuilders and champions aren't very good in their own right, but when Dorian retired in 98, there was an expectation that Flex Wheeler would come in. There was also an expectation that some of the other guys, Kevin Rowan, Sean Bray, etc., were going to come in. So Ronnie was very much not the heir apparent when he won. Flex Wheeler was both the people's assumption, but also the judges, the fitness writers, etc. They expected Flex to be the one to overtake and Flex to have that dominance. And Flex had a physique which was sort of Olympia ready. So it's the underdog story, but it's also the story that no one expected. You mentioned Jay Cutler, like that was the underdog story, but he's pulling in seconds to Ronnie, and in 01, arguably, depending who you talk to, should have actually beaten Ronnie for the Olympia. But Ronnie is not, he's not the underdog because no one's thinking of him in 98. And to go from a shock win in 98, which doesn't really happen in the Olympia, that there's a shock win. Like, there's, someone didn't come in as tight, someone did really well, but we don't expect, 9th to 5th to 1st, etc. in that trajectory. So to go from the shock win in 98 to winning the next year and the next year and the next year, and that is very, very unprecedented within the sport. And I think that's one of the reasons why people warmed to him, was he seemed to have that rise to riches, even though, as you said, genetically amazing, incredibly strong, had that powerlifting background, etc. But no one expected him to be where he was, especially that fast.
Yeah. And just another really interesting thing is there are a number of prominent pros who are in retirement who, and this is interesting to me just as someone who kind of looks at just the spectrum of physiques and differences in genetics. I just think it's really interesting, who have no reason to be, lying about this. And you have him claiming itself, also his roommate at the World Championships, Ron Coleman, who's a natural bodybuilder. And the fact that he actually went the World Championships route versus which is ironically I'd say a drug-tested show, not a natural show. At the time, it was one of the pathways to getting an IFBB Pro card outside of the U.S. Ronnie Coleman was, I think, 215 pounds when he turned pro, and he hit almost 300 pounds on stage. There's not a lot of things besides literally everything that can put 90 pounds of muscle on somebody or 80 pounds of muscle on somebody. So the story goes that he turned pro drug-free. He wouldn't be the only one to have claimed this, and I've talked on previous on Iron Culture about one notable example who, was able to surpass some people you would never expect him to the year they actually drug tested at the Arnold. But this is kind of on another level to have someone, turn pro and be a mid-level pro for a while and then eventually go like, what it seems like from an outsider and what people are saying, maybe I should do performance-enhancing drugs like the rest of these guys.
Yeah, and like that is the story. It's, you got his pro card as a natural. As you said, if you look at genetically how he was able to hold that much muscle mass, genetically how he's able to manage those weights. If you look at photos from early on in his career, if you look at photos from powerlifting, if you look at childhood photos or teenage photos, he is someone who was struck by lightning. So like, as you said, his competitors in that era of 90s and early 90s bodybuilding are pretty forthright about their views, sometimes when they shouldn't be, on topics that they shouldn't be talking on, but we'll leave that for a different day. So they have no skin in the game, and it is interesting and even funny, like looking at, because this was a generation who had been chasing Dorian Yates for so long. And then this guy seemingly comes out of nowhere. This is the guy that I think Flex Wheeler has said in The King, the brilliant Ronnie Coleman documentary, which we might talk about, almost like they felt sorry for Ronnie. Like, here's this guy, he's struggling, he's trying his best, clearly loves it, but like, come on, dude, this isn't working out. So for them to say he was natural, they have nothing to gain from it. Yeah. Especially because I know Flex is very magnanimous, but he's sort of usurped Flex Wheeler because the entire trajectory of that late 90s was Dorian, then Wheeler.
Conor, let's rewind for a moment because you've done a great job setting this up. The anticipation of Ronnie Coleman, how it was this stunning upset victory, and then his reign. Let's get that historical context of what the Mr. Olympia was leading up to that point in time. Who was winning? What was the judging criteria? Really set the scene, because I think Ronnie created an entire new classification and standard, which was basically kind of the standard for quite some time afterwards. But when he came on the scene, it was completely different. So can you set us up, let's maybe say from the 70s into the 80s into now the 90s with Ronnie? What were the judging standards, the criteria with which people were held, and what the judges were looking for essentially, and how maybe that changed over time and why that changed and so on and so forth?
And it's really good that you thought about different decades in that answer, because I would say the most tumultuous decade in terms of judging is probably the 1980s. At least before Lee Haney begins his great run. This is the late 70s, early 80s, where we start to see like Samir winning, in sort of 83, I think. We see Frank Zane obviously picking up a couple of Olympias, even Franco, to a certain extent, where there was a sense of, I think, looking for that leaner, tighter symmetry. Lee Haney, he's not a mass monster. I don't think it's fair to classify him. There's Lee Haney, who reign begins really in mid-1980s and runs up until Dorian in the 90s. But he is a sort of nudging the tide somewhat towards mass over everything else. Now, Lee is not that person. The person who really does that is Dorian Yates. But I think oftentimes Dorian Yates is seen as the mass monster in the 90s. He's the one who just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and symmetry started to get lost. And then Ronnie takes over from Dorian. I think it's a bit more nuanced than that if you look at Lee Haney, because the people he was competing against, Lee Labrada, Rich Gaspari, they went for leanness to try and overtake Lee Haney. Now, Lee always had that leanness, but he had this huge mass as well. So we have, I think, from the late 1980s until Ronnie's overthrown, and actually, it continues into Jay's reign in 05, sort of going into 08, we see this push towards mass over everything else. Now, they still have to be very lean, much leaner than previous decades, but they need to be bigger, 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 bigger. And what is interesting about that is, obviously, Sergio Oliva won in the 60s. So this is not to say that bodybuilders were never big. Arnold was obviously a mass monster for his era. but there's sort of a race to the biological bottom in terms of how much mass can we pack onto a frame. And I think what changes between Lee Haney to Dorian Yates in the 90s to Ronnie Coleman is the message of their training. Lee Haney, stimulate, don't annihilate. He is very forthright. Use good form, use good reps. Don't overstretch yourself in terms of the weight that you're using. Dorian Yates takes over from Lee Haney. He's a 6-time Mr. Olympia. He flips the script. Obviously, blood and guts, high intensity training. This is pushing still heavy weights, but going to like incredible depths in terms of the intensity in that training. And then Ronnie Coleman, I think most listeners would probably be familiar with his training videos where he starts to push insanely heavy weights for a bodybuilder at that time. And his generation are very forthright that Ronnie forced us all to train differently. If you look at Jay Cutler in 01 versus Jay Cutler in 06, you see a radical transformation in the amount of mass packed onto his physique. To overtake Ronnie, you needed to effectively become Ronnie and do it a little bit better. And that's what happens when he's eventually dethroned going for that 9th. So in terms of how the Olympia ebbs and flows, from 65 to maybe 75, we see a sort of privileging of mass, so to speak. And even like say Larry Scott, people wouldn't think of him as mass monster, but there's a lot of a lot of muscle packed onto that frame. I think mid 70s to mid 80s, the Olympia and the IFBB is trying to sort of figure out what it wants to be, and you do see more people being privileged who have that symmetry, that Frank Zane, Samir, who's criminally underrated in terms of an Olympian physique. But then I think from the mid to late 1980s until the mid 90s, you are seeing a steady progression in the amount of mass that's needed to win an Olympia. And this continues into Jay's reign. Phil Heath and Dexter Jackson, who wins in 08, like Heath is a mass monster, so to speak, but there's more of a discussion around his symmetry. From Ronnie's, I think, 4th to 8th Olympia, there's more of a discussion of his mass. So it's interesting how the physique standards change, and you asked about the judging, which is very important. The judging begins to be led by the physiques as opposed to the physiques begin to be led by the judging. And what I mean by that is you'll see, especially around the 01 Olympia in particular, the fans' favourite, and that's not always a good metric for who should win. In fact, it's very rarely a good metric for who should win. But for people of a certain philosophy, Jay Cutler should win because it's a total package, it's symmetrical, lean, muscular, etc. But Ronnie wins because the judging is clearly being led by how exceptional his physique is, how exceptionally large this man is, and how much muscle he can pack on. And this isn't me saying, the biggest guy wins, because we have Nasser Al-Somebody, later on we have Marcus Rule, etc. We have people who are bigger. We have Gunther as well, who I think is actually very pivotal in Ronnie getting as big as he does. So we have people who are bigger than Ronnie, but there is amazement, I would say, in terms of how much muscularity we can pack and still have a relatively symmetrical frame, but it's not Frank Zane symmetrical, right? Like it's not Franco symmetrical, it's not Samir symmetrical, it's not Rich or Lee symmetrical, etc. So I think the Ronnie story is the evolution of the mass monster in bodybuilding. The Ronnie story is also an evolution of training methods, and I think that's probably up there in terms of his influence. He doesn't have the Dorian Yates do my one brand of training, high intensity, but I think even for lay bodybuilding fans, and Eric, you can talk on this because you come, I think there was an expectation of, like, I'm loath to use the term, like power building during that time because of Ronnie.
Absolutely. I think the roots of power building probably, well, that's not fair, because obviously if we go back early enough, powerlifters, weightlifters, and bodybuilders were all the same thing.
Yeah.
But I would say the contemporary concept of what a power builder is probably finds itself in Ronnie most strongly, where he mid-prep puts on a squat suit and does a double with 800 pounds. Pulls in the 700s, if I recall correctly. 800. Pulls 800 pounds, So inclining 4 wheels for reps as part of his warm-up, like nonsense, Like he was so incredibly strong that I think it actually brought, maybe you need to be strong to be this big, into the conversation again. Where, and this is something that feels very cyclical to me, and I've only been lifting for 2 decades, right? Is that there's this, no, strength and hypertrophy are different. No, they're the same. No, strength and hypertrophy are different. No, they're the same. And we can't have any nuance in that conversation. So I would say, that is a probably apt description that didn't yet exist, but it was occurring. People knew what they were seeing and they changed their behavior, even though they weren't yet using the power building mantra or moniker, I should say.
And I think what's important about that is the visual culture of Ronnie's career, because we've all seen, yeah, buddy, and Dumbo Peanut, we've taken out, like, go to any gym in the mid 90s and hear someone scream, yeah, buddy, or lightweight. But that's actually really important because it was captivating. And you see with someone like Jay Cutler and later Phil Heath, there's a backlash to their training, especially Phil Heath, where people are like, he only trains with machines. What type of Olympia is this? Like, what type of Mr. Olympia is this? Because he's not pushing heavyweight. He doesn't deadlift. He prefers to do weighted back extensions. He prefers front squats over back squats. Like, he's within his reams. And even people are like, oh, those training videos are so boring. But like Ronnie, there was something that drew people in with those videos. And that's also why he was impactful in terms of the training, because he shaped both his competitors' ideas of how their physique should look and how they should train, but also the general public's ideas of what a Mr. Olympia does, what a bodybuilder has to do to train in a way that's arguably different to Arnold Schwarzenegger doing the rows and pumping iron, doing the squats. Like, it was high volume, but the weights weren't ineffable, you know, compared to what Ronnie does.
Conor, so let's understand this then, because what you're saying, going from the 70s, especially the mid 70s to the early 80s, where bodybuilding was trying to figure out its identity, then Lee Haney, then you said Dorian Yates, where he's more of a mass monster, blood and guts, his training intensity. Now, looking back retrospectively, it seems obvious, oh, Ronnie's kind of a continuation of two of those things. But then why was it that Flex Wheeler, on the other hand, if it seems like this is a potential trajectory we're going on, why he was the one that many were assuming, and why Ronnie was the underdog then to be the Mr. Olympia, if it seemed like at the time they started rewarding, you know, those things?
Can I provide my take on this?
Yeah, sure.
And then I'd love to get your perspective as you think this lines up with what general historical trends are.
Him being a peanut farmer.
Yeah, exactly. Which and who is ironically allergic to peanuts. So peanut, him and Jimmy Carter, Ronnie Coleman and Jimmy hanging out. The really interesting thing is that I noticed this narrative became a little too black and white. It went from Dorian Yates pushing the limits of mass, and then he just passed the baton directly to Ronnie. Ronnie did not look like the bubble gut mass monster that he got characterized as until he had already won 4 or 5 Olympias.
Him and Flex in 98 is it's a pretty straight shootout in terms of the physiques.
Exactly. Yeah. He looks like, oh my God, these guys both have itty bitty little waists. Maybe Flex Wheeler has just better lines overall, like, you know, the shape of his pecs, for example. But Ronnie has an itty bitty waist, which is the cornerstone, which is the centerpiece of symmetry. Everything is in reference to the waist. Your size is relevant to your waist and joints. So Ronnie it wasn't like, you know what, we were going to go symmetry with Flex, but we changed our minds. We're going to go with size. It was more like, is that a bigger Flex Wheeler? You know? And they were like, well, shit, I guess we got to go with Ronnie. And the same thing is also true of Dorian. Like, he didn't really start to have like the side effects of being a mass monster that really started to turn certain corners of the bodybuilding world off until the end of his career, until this 4th, 5th, 6th Olympia. He was bigger than everybody else, but he didn't sacrifice his waist. He always came in incredibly conditioned. And he basically had what Lee had and his competitors had combined. Lee Haney was incredibly symmetrical, but also really, really big, and everyone pushed conditioning to try to catch him. Gaspari is a great, example. And then, Dorian comes around, and he is diced to his socks, classic black and white photos, and he's huge. And then he keeps getting better. But eventually you go, oh, wow, what's going on with the gut? And then he finishes. And then they go, oh, wow, here's Ronnie, just as big. He's like Lee Haney plus like 5% or something like that. He doesn't have the gut. And it's actually not 4 or 5 Olympia wins until that happens. And so I do think it's the physiques leading the judging. I 100% agree, because Ronnie became so dominant and he was still so big and still had enough of those qualities that he became the person who kept winning. And then all the other competitors chased him. Everybody chased mass. And then Ronnie was seeing other competitors getting bigger, like the ones he pointed out. And then he got even bigger as well. And then we kind of found ourselves in, what happened? Like, we've gotten some really like too big physiques. And I think it's interesting that today, Ronnie Coleman's last Olympia win was 2005. We're almost 20 years later. They aren't actually bigger now than the biggest guys back then. That's the first time that's ever happened in the history of the Olympia.
And I think there's something, what's the expression? Like no raindrop thinks that it's part of the flood. Because as you said with Ronnie in 98, when he comes back in 99, okay, it's the Ronnie from last year, but he's a little bit bigger. 2000, okay, a little bit, like it's inching forward, so to speak. Well, it's not inching, like he packs on a lot of mass. And I can't remember, I think it's in Arnold or it's maybe one of the European tours where he gets a real scare from Gunther, who is a mass monster. And I think that does seem to push him into that bigger size. And there is actually something which I don't think is talked about enough in the open category, which is what happens with the longevity. So it's the same thing which happened to Phil. Phil Heath obviously takes over from Jay Cutler. He's the gift, beautiful lines, beautiful symmetry, beautiful physique. Where does he go from there? And it's adding on mass because they're already like they're shredded, they're dialed in, they're shredded, etc. So where do they go? So the longer an Olympian continues their reign, the more adding mass seems to be the option. And we see it in 2-on-2s and we see it in classic. Like we see if you're trying to hang on to your title, it's very hard to distinguish. And because your competitors are trying to overtake you, there is that push towards getting bigger. Now, I think where it gets slightly maybe problematic in the case of Ronnie is that the field stops trying to distinguish itself from him. And actually the open category right now is very interesting because the last 4 or 5 years in particular, there are different physiques, arguably, as much as these things can be different packages being put forward on the stage, like, Big Ramy versus Hadi, etc. Like they're different, it's a different kettle of fish. So Ronnie was so dominant that people began to try and emulate him. Whereas even with Dorian, I think people were still trying to do a little bit differently, like Kevin Vronin, etc. We're trying to give something slightly different in the hope that this would change things. And even arguably with Jay Cutler, he loses an Olympia to Dexter Jackson. There are people presenting differently, so to speak, in trying to outstage him. Whereas with Ronnie, I think this is maybe the first time that we see more and more people piling into, well, this is the way to win.
Yeah. I think that's exactly what it seems like to me, and I think that's a very apt description. Is never did you see it's almost like a concession by the other competitors. Like, okay, you're the best.
We can't do anything else.
We can't do anything else. When you listen to the attitudes of most athletes, I think Jay was maybe one of the only exceptions. They have a belief that they're going to win many times, or the belief that they can win, and I think. If that is now they'll all say they can, like, oh, I'm going to come in, we'll see what happens, I love my God and my mother and all that, the typical athlete stuff. But when they're saying what I have isn't the thing that wins, I need to have what he has and he's the champion, you've kind of already conceded that you don't think you can win. And I think Jay was maybe the one exception. Eventually, he was coming in. He's like, "No, I can beat Ronnie. He's starting to lose. I'm going to be as big as him, but I'm going to rein in, my blockiness, And he eventually did beat Ronnie, although Ronnie wasn't at his peak. So I think it was the first time when I look at the history and watch old videos and I look at the current crop where you have a reigning champ who everyone is kind of, whether they realize it or not, already conceding defeat.
Yep, and I think Jay has to get more credit in bodybuilding for the pragmatism, because again in 2001 this is when Jay, I think, presents as he wants to. By 2006 this is Jay saying, I'm going to beat him at his own game, and like he's very forthright that the judges said effectively you need to beat Ronnie on his best aspects, not your best aspects. So he pivoted into that, and I think that's a level of strategy that you often don't see. And obviously his physique was able to get to those lengths, etc. And I think this is what makes Ronnie very interesting, is that, in women's bodybuilding, Iris Kyle, obviously 10-time Miss Olympia, a similar fear and mystique. And I think with Ronnie, there was that sense of, if this guy stays injury-free, if he can present with arguably the same package or even a little bit less, 98% is still 98% of Ronnie Coleman, we can't beat him. And even, Dorian Yates, I would say arguably maybe finishes a bit early because injury starts to take a toll, not on how much he can train, but actually on how his physique looks. And he tears his tricep for the last Olympia, and this is a controversy in and of itself because his physique looks off. But like a half-fit Ronnie whose physique is still okay, people didn't know how to overtake that. And even as you say, when Jay wins, it's because Ronnie's a little bit less, and Jay is actually a lot more.
Yeah. And Jay will even admit that.
Oh, yeah.
He's like, I didn't beat Ronnie at his best, and there's not really any dissension. There's no kind of like his dominance is larger than the egos of the people in bodybuilding, which is saying something. To the point where they're like, yeah. And I mean, it's funny, you listen, like I highly recommend Ronnie Coleman, The King, great documentary. You hear like, Kevin Levrone reflecting and being like, honestly patronizing with the way he interacted with the Ronnie.
Didn't like Kevin's takes.
Yeah.
And guess what? He wasn't a Mr. Olympia. To your point, sorry, real quick, Eric, I love what you just said, where Jay, it's above their egos, where Jay was his fiercest competitor and he gave him his flowers because he was that dominant, whereas Kevin, who didn't win it, like a lot of the stuff at least that made it to the final cut, in my personal opinion, as you said, a little patronizing. He was the one, I think, Conor, to the point that said to Ronnie, like, is this for you, where he was preparing for another show?
Yeah.
Just all his takes, you know what I mean?
Well, the one thing, to Kevin's credit, he had that patronizing moment the day before the show, and then he saw him backstage, and he was like, "Oh, I'm done.
I can't do anything.
Yeah. So like, but it was a realization for him.
Yeah.
And you could tell that his natural position was, chest puffed up. I'm Kevin Levrone. I'm in it with all these other legends who are going to win, and we're all battling it out right now to see who's the top after, once Dorian's done and it's our time. And then he goes, "Oh, it's not our time."
Mm-hmm.
Conor, let me ask you this then. So we had the story leading up to Ronnie winning, Ronnie being the upset, some of the impacts of Ronnie. Let's talk a little bit more about his reign now. What was it like at the time? How impactful was it? Where, there's different eras, like Lee Haney won a bunch of Mr. Olympias, 8 of them. But what impact did it have at that time on the greater fitness space? Because I would make the argument, at least echoing down to them when I started lifting, Ronnie was that guy where, Jay certainly, and then around when I started training, it was like Jay and then in a Phil. But it seems like even at the time, sometimes what you do reverberates and then it increases in magnitude and then it becomes legendary. Like how many people actually were at, Arnold's competitions in 1972, 1973. But looking back, how monumental was it? So can you talk about in that time while he was winning, what was the perception? How important was it for the general fitness industry? Like I would say bodybuilding maybe at that time still had a large impact, whereas now, like with the shift recently in the last 2-3 years, like kind of, a classic bodybuilding where you have guys like Chris Bumstead where he is the moment. So can you talk a little bit about like that 8-year reign and even maybe that ninth year?
So I think you mentioned Arnold, which is really important because Arnold and Ronnie both change public perceptions of bodybuilding, both within the fitness space, but also I would argue outside of fitness. And the medium in which they do that is really important. So Arnold breaks out with Pumping Iron. This is important. It's the first in-depth bodybuilding documentary that cast it in a way that the general public can watch. That's great. Ronnie's reign coincides with YouTube. And this is not to denigrate or, put an asterisk or anything because that would be ridiculous. But what I mean is in terms of spreading who Ronnie is, if you look at Ronnie's reputation in, I would say 2000, 2001, okay, within bodybuilding, this man is fantastic, great champion, great physique, who can overtake him. If you look at Ronnie in 03, 04, he has a more global following. Like even people who are lay bodybuilders or just going to the gym know who Ronnie is, they know the memes, etc. Yeah, buddy. And like this is actually very important because it spreads the image of who the Olympia is. It also adds a lot of interest to who the Mr. Olympia is and what the Mr. Olympia is about. And because he's also competing in a field with a lot of legends who also have very good physiques, who have some cool backstories, etc. It does help to put it in a very kind way. I think Ronnie's reign and Ronnie's generation are the last to capture a huge amount of interest across the top 10, maybe even top 15. And this is a problem when, say, Generation Iron comes out in 2014, 2013, around that time, where people are saying, okay, so we have Phil Heath versus Kai Green. Okay, maybe Ben versus Branch Warren. Like there wasn't a huge amount of intrigue around that time because the sort of field was very different, etc. But also they didn't have that unifying figure. Phil Heath, who is an incredible bodybuilder, like we cannot discourage people from thinking that Phil Heath was not an incredible bodybuilder, but he didn't have that interest that the general public could latch onto. And this is very important because this is arguably the last time that bodybuilding has that great sway over general fitness. Now, you mentioned the 212s and CBUM, etc., but like we are now in an age of, say, powerlifting or power building or just more holistic training, for want of a better phrase. Ronnie, I would say his generation is the last when fitness effectively meant bodybuilding, especially in the way people train, but also the cultural touchstones, the languages, the ideas that we use when we describe fitness. Like now people might talk about RPE or they might talk about the big three, etc. Back then it was, yeah, buddy, it was doing high volume, it was doing like partial reps, etc. Because those Ronnie training videos were ubiquitous. And I think a lot of people who saw those videos, because I know, Eric, you watched the documentaries, it's unbelievable, etc. I think most people consumed Ronnie in 3-minute clips. And that was super important because those 3-minute clips were so captivating. So from a general fitness perspective, he was very important. He was a great face of bodybuilding. And more so because of those training videos. I think, you know, he obviously did other promotions. He was always in the Weeder mags, etc. But those videos were the things people latched onto. Now, within the sport, he was talked about as a once-in-a-generational talent by the second or third Olympia. Like, people knew the writings on the wall, the Weeder magazines, etc. knew, okay, this is the person we sort of nail our colours to, etc. But I think his legacy or his importance around that time is actually arguably in the general public and the general training sphere. And it's really fascinating for me as a historian because we see this intersection between technology and the Mr. Olympia, which doesn't really happen then again, I would argue, until Kai Green and YouTube and other forms of social media. So there's a broader discussion around technology and bodybuilding, which we don't need to go into.
No, Connor, I want to get into that because, Eric, would you agree with this? That for myself, Ronnie's reign was right at the tail. He was at the tail end of his reign. It was just at the beginning of me starting to train or being aware of this. Now we're talking high school before going off. My brother was lifting. The first bodybuilder, of course, I was aware of, Arnold, right? But I had a very superficial interest in bodybuilding. I was like, oh, like fitness, like exercise, good, right? And I knew who Ronnie was. I wonder if someone in 2023, someone who's like 16 then, getting into lifting, would know who the 2022 Mr. Olympia is, right? Speaking about the impact. But can you talk about, I think this is very important. I see it within myself, and then I want to understand it then for the general audience. Ronnie's training videos were impactful. They hit upon something in terms of the intensity, the like austerity of the situation. Like it's no nonsense. They're like pulling, like it's almost there was that golden era where you're on a beach. It's very nice. It's like a lifestyle that you're envious of, right? You want to get like kind of like, you train at the beach, you get the girls, you get the attention, and Ron's just getting after it. It's like pulling back the screen, so to speak. And that was appealing to me then as I got a little bit older and I was training. I still respected Ronnie. He was someone, some of those clips I'd watch and I found them motivational. Can you talk about that, Connor? Can you talk about that second life almost? And this is where people really enter that legendary status where they have their reign and then they have what they did and then people identify with it. Why do you think so many people identified with it? And why do you think people would say about Phil Heath with his training style or even Jay Cutler that it's uninteresting? I'm talking bodybuilding enthusiasts, which on the surface, what's the goal of bodybuilders? Just to get the best package, the total physique, right? So how you train shouldn't really be important if it's producing the results.
But it always has been.
So what is that? What's going on there? What is Ronnie doing or what's being shown that really touches one of those like foundational cultural aspects of lifting that people identify with?
So the three most important documentaries in the history of bodybuilding, I would say, is Pumping Iron, Blood and Guts, and Ronnie Coleman's Unbelievable. I think, or at least one of the Ronnie documentaries. We can pick out which one that we want. And it's really interesting to contrast Pumping Iron with Blood and Guts and Ronnie's training videos because we see a distinct shift in both the people who participate in bodybuilding, but also the image that bodybuilding at that elite level is representing. Pumping Iron, this is still part of, you said, like Muscle Beach, it's still Joe Weider promoting that West Coast lifestyle on the beach, etc. The most fascinating, it's not a historical book, but it's a really brilliant book, Sam Fusel's Confessions of a Bodybuilder, talks about how like hardcore, for want of a better phrase, bodybuilding became in the 1980s. There was a shift towards like dinginess, like, being manly, like attacking the weights, things that at the time seemed very real. Now they're maybe a bit pastiche and we mock at times. But when you look at Dorian Yates in the Dungeon Gym in Birmingham, there is a grittiness, there is a realness, there is a pain, there is look and see, you know, for want of a better phrase, what's going on, like what is he doing, this is incredible, in a way that I think only, say, Tom Platz's training videos ever, you know, Tom Platz on the leg extension, kill me, like literally screaming kill me as he's effectively attacking the machine is the only way to describe it, you know. And when you look at Ronnie in Metroflex, it's a throwback to Dorian, it's a throwback to Tom Platz, but we also have insane numbers being lifted on the bar as well. So I think we get that grittiness, we get like the anger in it, it's made for motivational videos, you know, right? And this is part of it. But there's also that, I would argue, say, almost like an old physical culture element. Like, what is that? Is he lifting that? Can he lift that? Can any human lift that? There's that outside interest that can be brought into it as well. And I think that's one of the reasons that it captivated people was the like, oh my God, this is incredible. Arguably, like, you know, seeing him pulling the 800-pound deadlift, squatting 800 pounds, like there are very few, because I've looked at way too many, there are very few lifting videos that will, I'll say, like, capture the human will against adversity. And not like real talk, you know, Matthias Steiner in the Olympics is the number one, like that can never be topped for me personally. But like Ronnie doing that and seeing the way he trained, you can feel the pain oozing through those videos, the determination, the hard work. It encapsulates what hardcore bodybuilding was marketing itself as. Now, I'm not saying Ronnie, you know, like he was like, okay, I'll do this for the video, then let's do like, you know, the itty bitty tricep kickbacks and then we'll call it a day. But it seems to validate that hardcore aesthetic, which begins in the 1980s, as I would say, sort of an underground movement, so to speak, because Lee Haney, stimulate, don't annihilate. It's the people trying to catch up with Lee Haney that seem to push for that hardcore training, like literally killing yourself in the gym, or at least screaming kill me in the gym. Thank God people aren't literal. But I think that's the reason why it's so captivating. It's hardcore training. It's the look and see that'll bring people in from outside of bodybuilding. So you'll also get the validation from the powerlifters, the Olympic lifters, you know, the general public, etc. And then for that time in bodybuilding, when social media is becoming more important, and I'm going to be honest, when a lot more young men are being exposed to bodybuilding in an online setting, this is something that will capture what I think is oftentimes a adolescent interest in bodybuilding, which is what is a man, that looks awesome, that's hardcore. And I think that's why it's so important from like a visual culture and a sharing of it. And even now those clips are still used. So I think there is something to that sort of technological lens to it, but there's also something to that hardcore, and Metroflex is actually very central in that story.
Yeah, and I think it feels like a cementing of hardcore culture in the digital media, on the forums, and it is exactly like it's very similar to Blood and Guts because they're both dungeons. And I think Metroflex probably deserves a little bit of discussion here because it went on to, I mean, I think we can't credit Ronnie with the person who started being a hardcore bodybuilder. Like you said, it started in the 80s, it was a thing, but there are like the emergence of hardcore gyms. And we think of like the way Branch Warren trained, and it's almost like there are different styles and different ways of lifting that can be termed hardcore, but the central piece to it, it's like when you enter the gym, that is all you're doing. You're bringing everything you can, and you will not leave that workout until you've committed everything. And that intensity, you know, the words we use, they're very visceral when we describe something like hardcore, and you know it when you see it. And I think that's exactly why it being on YouTube was important. You can tell when someone is really getting after it, and when going to do a workout is something that is going to get them their adrenaline pumping. They're going to be like the actual feeling is being afraid, like I'm going to do something that hurts today, you know, and I'm going to get excited about it. I'm going to find enjoyment in it, and we're going to go all out. And I just think that is at its core something that appeals to bodybuilders in a broad sense. So maybe to finish this off with talking about the environment he trained in, because I think the setting of the play of Ronnie is just as important as the actor.
Completely. So obviously you mentioned Ronnie, you know, trained at Metroflex Gym. This started by Brian Dobson in 87, maybe 86, 87, but certainly 87. And Brian Dobson, who people will see, he's the guy, you know, spotting Ronnie in a lot of his videos, and that's not derogatory. I just mean that's how most people would know him. He's a great bodybuilder in his own right, incredibly strong in his own right. but he's continuing a lineage of dungeon gyms that are hardcore. And like it's important to distinguish between the gym and the idea of hardcore, because like arguably go into any powerlifting gym, you know, around the country, see someone who would describe a set as like an RP9 or an RP10, like it's pretty hard, like, you know what I mean, like they're pushing themselves, etc. But hardcore in a bodybuilding setting, especially in a dungeon gym, there's often like a backdrop you'd see in like a Batman movie, you know what I mean, or like a Batman comic book. Like it's usually dark, it's like kind of filthy, and like Brian and Ronnie have both said this is dirty, and I think the King, Ronnie says like, you know, I know this is filthy and dirty, but I don't want to train anywhere else. So there's that like background aesthetic. But I think what's important to think about these hardcore gyms is they've always defined themselves against an other. And what I mean by that is they've always defined themselves against commercial gyms. They've always defined themselves against gyms where people don't train hard enough. They've always defined themselves against a sort of, I'm going to say weaker in inverted commas, but I think you know what I mean, because when even you look at some iconic lines, you know, everybody wants to be a bodybuilder, but ain't nobody want to lift no heavy ass weight. When you look at Branch, who also trains at Metroflex, Branch Warren, when you look at some of the things that are said about Brian Dobson and Ronnie in terms of how they train, it is that like we are striking out against the general fitness climate because we are going to push ourselves to an extent that no one else possibly would. And this is something that an individual can embody, Tom Platz, or it's something that a place can embody. And Ronnie is perfectly situated for a Metroflex gym because the gym's ethos, and if you read interviews with Brian Dobson, I'm so excited to talk to Brian Dobson because I think he's very important in this story. He is immediately on establishing Metroflex in 87, setting this out as a hardcore gym. So when Ronnie joins Metroflex in the 90s and Brian Dobson literally picks Ronnie out and says, I will give you a free gym membership, come here, he's going into a place that is established with a certain training etiquette. I think what's so interesting is Ronnie probably would have won an Olympia without that hardcore training, but the marrying of the 3 reps on 800 pounds in squats, the marrying of the 2 reps on 800 pounds on a deadlift and the incline, like the 200 pound dumbbells for the flat press, etc., that adds to Ronnie's physique and it adds to his mystique. So there is this mirroring of where he trains with who he is as a trainee. And even Branch Warren has been very vocal about like Metroflex fitting a certain idea of what bodybuilding is, but also fitting a certain idea of what intensity and hardcore is. So I think it's great that we're interviewing Ronnie in Metroflex and also interviewing Brian, because I think you get a greater appreciation for what the place is and how the place shapes the individual.
Gents, what started as an idea, a mere, just a kernel of a thought that if we can make this happen, now it is going to happen. This has been the Road to Ronnie episode. I could say for myself, and I want maybe everyone just to leave their own comments, I'm actually very excited about this. Where thinking back, and like I said, there's several reasons why I actually and I've talked about this before. Once I found out about more bodybuilders, Frank Zane, the golden era, where I saw myself and whatnot. Some people, enjoy seeing those muscular hunks go at it. Then you saw Phil Heath and whatnot come at. That was around the time I was actually like really training. But Ronnie always had that respect, and he has that respect of a lot of people, such as myself, where they're, on a mere cursory level, interested in some of those things. Oh, that's Ronnie. Oh, that's how he trained and what he accomplished and his impact. So just the possibility of being able to chat with him, going to Metroflex again. I went there a decade ago with Big J. And Brian Dobson at the time gave me like 40 minutes of his time, was very generous, very interesting atmosphere in terms of how I think it's exactly as Brian wants it. And I think that culture, to your point, influenced who came, the results that they got, how they trained, and then the generation that followed. And it was something that was a continuation from before that started as an underground movement. So I'm just very excited about this. And I think it's just a very cool moment.
Yeah, I'm giddy, to be honest. I'm really looking forward to this. Interestingly enough, and one thing we haven't talked about is, and I'll just leave it as my final thoughts because it encapsulates why Ronnie is someone I have a deep respect for, and I think many do, is that, like Kevin Lerone said, and he was like, man, I don't like bodybuilding. I have to do this to win this. He goes, and why are you still doing this? You're placing ninth. And Ronnie goes, man, I love bodybuilding. And he's like, and you really do. And he basically said, I don't. This dieting is hard. I like to win. And if I wasn't winning, I wouldn't do it. Literally, that's what Kevin Lerone said. So is what it is, no judgment. And Ronnie still trains. Despite the injuries, despite the fact that he's in pain, despite the fact that he's not just training to win, he's not even competing anymore. And he clearly still loves it. And we were talking earlier about, well, actually, there's no reason why we should focus on the training. It's just bodybuilders who are trying to get a certain physique. So it's a means to an end. It's never been. And it never has been for the culture. And for Ronnie, it so clearly isn't. Training is what's central. And he happened to have the broken mold genetics and the environment and the right timing to be as dominant a force as he was. But that doesn't matter. Ronnie is about the life, and he still is, and that's why I feel like I relate to him. As different as people that we obviously are, I think that's why, to me, I'm so excited to talk to him.
I mean, like, to finish on what Eric said, oddly, he is almost, the quintessential physical culturist in that sense of training is something central to him. I always go back to Randy Roach's definition of a physical culturist as someone who, when all the gyms are closed, there's no barbells, no dumbbells, find a way to train. And that isn't in a hardcore, like, you do what you have to, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But it's like, this is a central component of his life, and he got to express that. I think it's going to be fascinating to talk to him in the place where that began. So to quote a AEW wrestler, Matt Bernard, this makes Daddy Magic's nipples very hard.
Conor, it is always fantastic having you on the podcast. Gents, I'm super excited for this. The next episode will be then the Ronnie recap episode where we give our thoughts. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. You could go ahead and leave a rating and review. People typically will give 5 stars. Leave it to your own discretion. But once again, if you're not giving 5 stars, what are you doing? We're back every single insert date here from now until the end of time. We'll catch you in that next episode.